The halls of Rivendell lay quiet in the soft glow of early evening, where shadow and light played across the carved stone, tracing patterns older than the memory of men. Outside, the last homely house breathed in the sigh of the wind through autumn leaves, carrying stories from distant corners of Middle-earth, some whispered, some sung by unseen voices. Here, in this calm yet watchful sanctuary, Gandalf paused at a window, eyes distant, tracing the shape of the mountains that framed the valley. His mind, usually restless with counsel and caution, lingered on a different kind of concern. The seeing stones, the Palantíri, whose existence was known to few and whose danger was often misunderstood. He had glimpsed their power from afar, through subtle disturbances in thought and gesture, and he felt the tremor of their influence as keenly as one might feel a distant storm on the horizon. The stones were not mere instruments. They were sentient in their effect, a mirror that revealed both truth and temptation. To gaze upon one was to invite clarity, but clarity could be as corrosive as fire, eroding certainty, bending intention, and amplifying desire or fear. Gandalf had observed this principle through the actions of those who held the stones without wisdom, and he had learned to measure the weight of insight against the quiet cost it demanded. Even the mightiest could falter under their scrutiny, and he understood that the stone's danger did not reside solely in the hands of Sauron, the Dark Lord, but in the vulnerability of those who sought to wield knowledge without restraint. He thought of Orthanc, black and shining in the distance, where Saruman's ambition had already begun to twist the purpose of a stone meant for counsel into a trap of pride. The tower's sharp edges caught the last light of day, and Gandalf could feel the subtle pull of its palantir, reaching outward in thought, hinting at visions no one fully commanded. It was not merely a matter of spying or gathering intelligence. It was a conduit, a channel in which one mind might drown another, where will was tested and, if found weak, reshaped. In his mind he traced the paths of previous users, the delicate interactions of perception and projection, and he recognized the delicate mechanisms of influence that these ancient relics had embedded into the course of history. Yet Gandalf's concern was not limited to distant towers or the ambitions of men and wizards. He understood that the stone's reach was subtle and patient, their danger often hidden behind the allure of certainty. Even the wisest could misread what the stone offered, interpreting a vision as absolute when it was shaped by unseen hands or by the inexorable weight of their own hopes and fears. The stone did not lie, but it did not speak entirely. Its truth was a living thing, twisting and shimmering, offering revelation at the price of unanticipated burden, and the cost of that revelation could be ruin, slow and inevitable, or sudden and devastating. Gandalf turned from the window, the colors of twilight softening the edges of the valley, and considered the threads that wove through his memory. Glimpses of distant towers, the subtle tremors in thought that accompanied knowledge, the quiet despair of those who could not see beyond the stone's reflection. Each was a breadcrumb, a warning, a lesson that demanded vigilance and humility. In his heart he carried a deep respect, mingled with fear, not for Sauron's brute will, but for the stones themselves, and for what they could compel even the strongest to do. The evening deepened, and the shadows in the corners of the hall lengthened. Yet Gandalf's mind remained alert, attuned to currents unseen by others. He considered the broader tapestry of Middle-earth, the interlocking destinies of elves, men, and wizards, all affected in ways subtle or overt by these instruments of sight. The Palantíri, he realized, were a quiet force in the shaping of history, and it was in understanding their mechanisms, their patterns, their reach, their cost, that one might navigate the perils they presented. He paused before the hearth, the warmth of fire brushing his robes, and exhaled slowly, aware of the weight of foresight pressing upon him. The path forward required care, a measured dance between action and observation, between revealing and withholding, between guiding and restraining, and yet, in the quiet of Rivendell, with the mountains standing sentinel beyond the valley, Gandalf knew that understanding this danger was not enough. One must also respect it, temper ambition with patience, and recognize the subtle manipulation embedded in every reflected image. For the Palantíri did not merely show, they shaped, and their shape was perilous. Outside, the wind carried the last golden leaves down the slopes of the mountains, a gentle rustle that whispered of paths not yet taken, of visions not yet seen, and of dangers that lay quietly in the stones, waiting for the unwary to look too long. Gandalf, in that still moment, felt the burden of vigilance settle upon him, and he understood fully why fear, calm and considered, was wiser than the certainty of power. The moon had risen high above the towers of Rivendell, casting pale light through arched windows and across stone floors that remembered the footsteps of kings. In the stillness, Gandalf's thoughts lingered on the stone that had once rested in the watchtower of Amon Sul, lost now yet not forgotten. His mind traced the arc of its journey, not by geography but through the patterns of consequence it had left behind. There was a gravity to the Palantíri that went beyond their making. They were not artifacts alone, they were mirrors held too close, reflecting not only the world but also the unseen forces that shaped it. The stones had been designed for unity, crafted by the elves of Valinor and gifted to the faithful of Númenor, to serve as bridges across distance, to preserve trust among far-flung watchmen. But in the quiet erosion of time, that unity decayed. Each stone meant to extend vision now pulled the minds of its bearers inward, tightening their focus, shortening their patience, until clarity became obsession. Even before Sauron's touch returned to the world, the Seeing Stones had begun to shape decisions with quiet insistence, like wind carving stone. In Minas Tirith, the great hall bore the echo of a different kind of vision. Denethor, the steward of Gondor, stood day after day before a black sphere, veiled beneath cloth, unseen by his council, but never untouched by his mind. There, in the citadel, the Palantir whispered truths, twisted just enough to become traps. Denethor believed himself strong, immune to manipulation. Yet Gandalf knew strength was not a shield against misinterpretation. If anything, it was a blade that cut inward, deeper than one realized, until the wound became identity. The mechanism was insidious. The stone showed what was, but never why. A fleet would appear on the horizon, black sails and all, and the heart would constrict. Was it salvation or doom? The Palantir did not say. It revealed only image, never motive. And in that silence, Sauron spoke more clearly than any voice. His power, when threaded through the lens of the stone, did not need to deceive outright. It needed only to show selectively, allowing the mind of the viewer to finish the lie themselves. Gandalf had watched it unfold with the subtle inevitability of winter. Denethor, once cautious and proud, began to speak in absolutes. Hope was folly, he said. Allies would not come. The king would not return. Each declaration carried the rhythm of certainty, but beneath it, Gandalf heard the echo of the stone, a cadence of dread disguised as wisdom. The steward no longer ruled from vision but from reaction. He was not merely shown the enemy's strength, he was made to feel the futility of resistance, and in that despair, policy hardened, allies were spurned, and the fate of Gondor veered. What was most tragic, Gandalf reflected, was not that Denethor believed a lie, but that he believed a partial truth. The ships were real, the darkness grew. Yet truth, when fragmented and uncontextualized, becomes indistinguishable from deception. That was the genius of the Palantíri, and their peril. They did not need to corrupt, they only needed to reveal. The mind would do the rest. In this, Gandalf saw the deeper fear, why he, among all the wise, avoided the stones despite their promise. It was not that he doubted his strength, but that he respected the architecture of the stones themselves. They were not tools to be wielded, but forces to be reckoned with. A mind engaging a Palantír was not a hand turning a key, it was a soul entering a current, and where that current led was never entirely within one's choosing. Thus, as Denethor unraveled under the weight of visions half understood, Gandalf took no satisfaction in his foresight. He had not warned the steward, Denethor would not have listened. To warn a man already falling is to confirm the distance yet to fall. Instead, Gandalf watched and waited, guiding what he could, preparing what remained. He whispered counsel where it might seed, nudged the hearts of others toward alliances, and trusted that some threads would resist unraveling entirely. Outside the tower, beneath the stars, the winds shifted over the Pelennor. The white city stood, tall and defiant, unaware of the silent battle taking place, not on its fields but in its high tower, in the chamber where a man and a stone stared endlessly at one another. Gandalf in those moments thought not of victory or defeat, but of distortion, how vision could become a curse, how knowledge could isolate more thoroughly than ignorance. And so, as night deepened and the fires of the watchposts dimmed, Gandalf's gaze returned to the distant horizon. He felt the quiet ripple of another mind elsewhere far to the north, one who also held a stone, a different hand, a different will. Saruman. There too a struggle unfolded, veiled in silence and pride, one that would demand a different kind of attention. Before he could understand how Saruman's descent had mirrored or diverged from Denethor's, Gandalf knew he must confront the source, the Tower of Orthanc and the stone that lay within it. The Tower of Orthanc rose like a black spear against the pale throat of the sky, its sharp lines untouched by age, unmarred by weather. Built in forgotten years by hands that no longer existed, it stood now as the mind of Saruman, high, hard, and impervious. But beneath its gleaming walls, something had shifted. What once had been a place of study had grown still and cold, like the interior of a stone that remembers fire. Gandalf had felt it before he had seen it, the change in the air, the breathless silence, the scent of will twisted tight. Saruman, once the head of the White Council, had begun to move differently, not with urgency but with certainty, the kind that does not consult but glares. And somewhere deep within Orthanc, the stone lay open, the Palantír. Gandalf had not seen it himself in Saruman's keeping, but he did not need to. He knew the way Saruman spoke, curt, deliberate, possessed of a knowledge no scout had brought, no ally had shared, betrayed the shape of another source. Saruman had turned to the stone, perhaps out of strategy at first, or ambition hidden behind necessity. But the tone of his thought had changed. Certainty had hardened into arrogance. Vision had narrowed into obsession. It was not sudden, this change. That was the brilliance and the curse of the Palantír. It did not seize, it suggested, and in its suggestions lay an invitation to superiority. The whisper that one sees what others cannot, that one is needed precisely because others are blind. Saruman, in his pride, had accepted that invitation long before he admitted it. He had once spoken with Gandalf under the eaves of Fangorn, before Orthanc was sealed to all but his own will. There had been an edge in his voice, a dryness that had not been there before. He spoke of tides rising in the east, of wisdom needing to act rather than wait, of aligning with strength to preserve what remained of order. Gandalf had listened, and within the words he heard a rhythm not Saruman's own. For when one looks into a Palantír, one does not see freely. The image bends to the strength of the opposing mind. And Sauron was strong not merely in power, but in direction, in clarity of purpose. He knew what he wanted the viewer to see, and he had waited for Saruman's gaze. When it came, the Dark Lord did not corrupt in form, but in proportion. He offered vision in slices, armies gathering, cities weakening, the futility of resistance. Saruman, believing himself peer to any mind, did not recognize that he had already begun to interpret the world through a lens he did not shape. What began as analysis became justification. The stone showed war. Therefore war must be inevitable. The stone showed the rising of Mordor. Therefore to align with it was not betrayal but adaptation. Saruman had not fallen in a single moment. He had tilted slowly, until his foundation no longer supported him. Gandalf had sensed the tilt before he understood the depth. He had come to Orthanc not with accusation, but with caution, still believing that Saruman's intellect would resist whatever dark influence pressed upon it. He found instead a tower barred, a welcome rehearsed, and a conversation laced with implications. Saruman's questions pressed too close to secrets Gandalf had not voiced. His analysis of movements, of paths and threats, was too precise, as if he watched from a vantage none had granted him. And when the door was finally shut and Gandalf stood alone in the high chamber of stone and wind, he understood. The Palantíri had been uncovered. Its vision was not merely informing Saruman, it was guiding him. Worse still, Saruman believed it his to command. The mind that had once counseled Elrond and Galadriel now thought itself above them, not because it had grown stronger, but because it had been shown a future arranged by another hand. Gandalf's fear deepened, not at the thought of Sauron possessing the stones, but at the thought of Sauron not needing to. The stones remained where they were, but through them, the Dark Lord touched minds, not with lies, but with patterns of sight designed to erode resistance. Saruman was not a puppet. He still believed himself free, and that was what made him most dangerous. As Gandalf had stood atop Orthanc in the days before imprisonment, the wind curling about his cloak, he had looked outward and thought not of strategy, but of blindness. For what was Saruman seeing now? What interpretation had he made of the world that would justify his silence, his secrecy, his slow alignment with ruin? The Palantíri had not taken his will. It had taken his context. And context, once reshaped, changed everything. Saruman still acted, but now he acted within the story Sauron had shown him, believing it to be his own. Far below, the roots of the tower curled into deep earth, and the stone, veiled in darkness, sat waiting, passive and open, revealing and withholding, exacting its cost without speech. And above, Gandalf knew he would not reach Saruman again, not through counsel, not through memory. That door had closed the moment the stone had been turned to the east. Yet there was still time to act elsewhere, to protect the others, to intervene not with force, but with caution, with silence, with redirection. But before Gandalf could begin that work, he would need to understand the shape of resistance itself, how to see without being seen, and how to guide without succumbing. The wind across the plains of Rohan carried with it the scent of change, dry grass, distant ash, the faint metallic edge of unease. Gandalf rode not with haste, but with thought, his cloak trailing like a shadow behind him, his eyes narrowed against a future only partially glimpsed. He had left Orthanc behind, not with answers but with clarity. Saruman was lost, not by force but by belief, and now it fell to Gandalf to resist, not by confrontation but by precision. Restraint was a kind of courage, one rarely praised and even more rarely understood. In an age where enemies declared themselves in flame and armies, Gandalf chose silence, not from fear, but from knowledge. The Palantíri were not merely weapons to be avoided. They were lenses through which the very shape of hope could be bent. To protect what remained of free will, Gandalf would not meet the gaze of the stones. He would not lift the veil. He would not see. And in that decision, deliberate, heavy, lay his truest defiance. He moved through the lands like a quiet thread, never staying long, never drawing attention. He whispered truths to kings who still listened, reminded the wise of old warnings, placed hands gently on the shoulders of those still learning their strength. He did not reveal all. To do so would risk more than ignorance ever had, for even true knowledge, once known, could be manipulated if seen through the wrong frame. The Palantíri taught him that. Thus he guided with riddles and parables, cloaking strategy and suggestion. To Theoden, he spoke of storms not yet visible. To Aragorn, of paths that would only open if sought without certainty. To Frodo, of burdens that must remain unseen by all but the bearer. He became a steward of unseen knowledge, not hoarder, not deceiver, but guardian of the boundary between truth and its distortion. There were moments he felt the weight of this restraint like a stone in the soul. When others pressed for answers, when time pressed forward, when allies looked to him with expectation heavy in their eyes, he did not always meet them with what they wished to hear. He offered instead the gift of incomplete vision, a trust in choice rather than a dictated future, and in that space, others found their strength. To reveal all would be to set the stage for a different kind of domination, one masked as guidance. This was the lesson the Palantíri whispered. Even help, if overextended, becomes control, and control, however well-intended, becomes a mirror of the enemy. Gandalf had seen this unfold in Saruman, a will too certain, a vision too complete. He would not repeat it. There were days when the temptation stirred, when danger mounted and decisions narrowed. He would feel the silent beckon of the stones, not from possession, but from presence, the knowledge that they were there, waiting, offering their visions to any who dared. In these moments, Gandalf would turn inward and remind himself that wisdom was not in knowing all paths, but in walking the right one without needing to see the end. He had once stood beside Elrond in council, watching as maps were unrolled and possibilities laid bare like wounds. The others spoke of armies, of spies, of numbers. Gandalf had said little. Instead, he watched how they chose to think, how easily they reached for strategies that depended on superior knowledge. He knew what lay at the end of that thinking. He had seen it in the fires of Orthanc, in the weary eyes of Denethor, and so he gave what guidance he could, not as declarations but as questions. Not where to strike, but why. Not who to trust, but how. His resistance to the Palantíri was not a passive retreat, but a campaign of shadows, a deliberate refusal to let sight become master. In the clarity the stones offered, he saw the ruin of freedom, and in the obscurity he embraced, he saw possibility. His path would not be recorded in the songs, no great battles, no crowns claimed, but it was no less pivotal, for in a war of sight and will, Gandalf chose to be the unseen factor, the one force unmeasured by the enemy, because it could not be predicted, only felt. Above him, stars turned silently, older than towers, older even than the stones that bore their glimmer. Somewhere, Sauron moved his mind across the plains of thought, seeking to claim what he could not yet touch. And Saruman, deeper still in his tower, believed himself unseen even as he broadcast his soul into the storm. Gandalf did not answer. He had turned his mind inward, building a silence no Palantír could penetrate. He had become a watcher of watchers, a keeper of restraint, a guardian of the unseen. And now, the time approached to look deeper, not into the stones, but into the structure of their power. For before one could resist fully, one had to understand How did the Palantíri work? And what exactly did they cost? The stones did not blink. They did not pulse or hum. They sat in silence, cold and smooth, revealing nothing until gazed upon. Yet within them, entire realms of vision stirred, layered, distant, and dangerously close. To understand why Gandalf had turned away, one must first understand what a Palantir truly was. Not a tool in the crude sense, but a conduit, a bridge of will between 2 points in space, or between 2 minds across time. Crafted by the elves of Aman long before Númenor's rise, the Palantíri were born of a wisdom deep and luminous. Their purpose was noble, to bind realms together, to allow sight without travel, understanding without delay, and for a while they served 7 stones, each attuned to the others, each placed in towers where trust once ruled. But time, as always, frayed the fabric of intention. The mechanism was simple in design, yet vast in implication. A Palantir did not invent images, it reflected what was the truth seen from afar. But it was not omniscient. It could not show all things at all times. Its gaze was limited by the strength and focus of the user's will, and by the alignment of the other stones. What one saw depended not only on what was present to be seen, but on what one sought and on who might be watching in return. This was the first danger, the illusion of clarity. What the Palantir revealed could be truthful and still misleading. A dark ship upon the Anduin might be a corsair or a friend sailing under duress. A ruined city might be a fresh loss or a long-abandoned ruin. The stone showed image, not meaning. But the mind, ever hungry for conclusion, imposed meaning the instant sight was granted. The second danger lay in contact. When 2 minds gazed through Palantíri at once, they touched not as flesh touches, but as thought contends. Strength of will determined dominance. If the user was weaker than the one on the other end, their vision would bend, twist, or fracture entirely. If Sauron held one stone and Saruman another, their connection was not a conversation. It was a contest. One saw what the other permitted, or what they willed to be seen. And in that contest, the victor was not merely observer, but shaper. Yet the stones could also act unbidden. If left uncovered and unattended, they would stir, especially in the presence of great emotion or need. They could call to one's thoughts, offer glimpses as bait, draw the curious toward visions that lingered like half-remembered dreams. A man might approach seeking counsel and leave believing in destiny. This was the third danger, the erosion of perspective. Over time, frequent use of the Palantir led the mind to rely on it, to trust its clarity over memory, over instinct, over wisdom. It became a lens through which all the world was filtered. What was not seen in the stone ceased to matter. What was seen gained disproportionate weight. Denethor had fallen this way. So had Saruman. And so would others, if left unguided. Gandalf knew this not by rumor, but through long contemplation. In the early days of his coming, when he was yet cloaked in new form and fireless patience, he had studied the lore of the stones. He had traced their history through old scrolls in Lindon and Elos. He had touched the pedestal of the Lost Stones chamber, where only dust remained, and he had listened to the quiet in that absence. Even then, he had sensed the tension, the way these objects designed to serve order had become fault lines in the will of Middle-earth. He had never used one, not once, not because he could not, but because he would not. For he understood that knowing was not mastery, that to see clearly was not to act wisely. His power lay in judgment, not vision, in understanding when to step back from the edge of certainty. The Palantíri offered a kind of false maturity, the feeling of control without its burden, the sense of foresight without its humility. There was also perhaps a fourth danger, one unspoken even among the wise. The stones were relics of an age closer to the undying lands, bound to a pattern of fate beyond the full comprehension of mortal or Maya. They resonated not only with sight, but with destiny. To gaze into one was to open oneself not just to what was, but to what might be, and in doing so to become part of the shaping. The future, once glimpsed, exerts its own gravity. Decisions follow vision, and vision once manipulated chains the future to a lie. This Gandalf feared above all else. Not fire, not armies, not the malice of the enemy, but the quiet conviction in a leader's voice who has seen and no longer questions. He had heard it in Denethor, he had heard it in Saruman, and he would guard others against it. But to do so he would need more than silence. He would need examples, stories of the stones used, and what they took. For only through cost could others be made to understand what was truly at stake. The moonlight shimmered across the stone flanks of Orthon, casting pale reflections down its obsidian ribs. Inside, the tower no longer echoed with the quiet movements of study. Scrolls had been pushed aside. Windows remained shuttered. The Palantíri stood unveiled, a black eye at the center of the chamber. Saruman's hands hovered near it. Not touching, not quite. He did not need to. The connection had long been established. It had begun with curiosity, innocent, or so he told himself. A question about the South, a suspicion about Mordor, a desire to know what others could not. The stone obliged. It always did. Clear images at first, a rider, a host, a mountain under ash, then sound or something like it, the deep suggestion of movement beneath the earth, wheels turning, and with that, the alignment began. He did not notice the change, not at first. His tone sharpened, his hours lengthened, counsel became command. He saw things others did not, and in that knowledge he grew alone. The stone became his closest confidant, and like all such relationships, it reshaped him. He believed he commanded it, but each night he returned to it. And each night it gave him a vision he had not asked for, and yet could not ignore. There was an elegance to it. The Palantíri did not speak. It revealed, and in doing so it allowed Saruman to believe the conclusions were his own. This was its power, the slow redirection of purpose by means of reflection. He saw the strength of Mordor, the sheer inevitability of it, hosts that blotted out hills, smoke that did not lift, armies ready before allies stirred. It was truth that made it worse. From that truth he crafted a strategy. He would ally, not in name, not in soul, but in posture. He would bend only until the storm passed. In the meantime, he would build power of his own, a force in Isengard to rival what lay in the east. And when the moment came, when the tide turned, he would rise again, not as a servant, but as a master among masters. But the Palantíri was no passive mirror. Sauron watched too, and where their wills touched, Sauron pressed ever forward. The Dark Lord knew better than to offer orders. He offered implication. He let Saruman see the way the world bent, the way men faltered, the way the elves withdrew. He fed certainty. And Saruman, for all his learning, mistook certainty for control. Gandalf had known it the moment he was imprisoned atop Orthanc. Not from what Saruman said, but from what he didn't. He no longer questioned. He no longer sought counsel. He recited outcomes as if reading from a book already written. His eyes no longer searched, they declared. The stone had not blinded him. It had narrowed him. And as he walked the spiraling stairs of his own tower, the Palantíri still glowing behind his locked doors, Saruman convinced himself he remained untainted, that his use of the stone was strategic, that he bent but had not broken. But the choices told a different story. The felling of Fangorn's trees, the forging of a new breed of orc, the surveillance of Rohan's riders. These were not preparations against Sauron. They were echoes of him. There came a night when the Palantíri flared without touch. Saruman approached, uncertain. The image shown was Barad-dûr, towers of iron and flame rising higher than any peak in the west, and behind it a shape, a will, a gaze without eyes. He felt it, not as heat or sound, but as pressure, not pain, expectation. The vision passed, but the silence that followed bore a weight more profound than command. He told no one, not even Grima. But after that night his voice changed. Not louder, quieter, flatter, as if the outcome was no longer in doubt. He no longer planned for victory. He prepared for alignment, and the Palantíri, satisfied, began to offer less. The images grew rarer, the insights shallower, but by then it no longer needed to convince. The shaping was complete. Saruman had ceased to resist. The stone had given him not falsehood, but a single truth repeated until all other possibilities dissolved. Thus was Orthanc turned, not by siege or spell, but by sight. Gandalf had watched it happen from without and within. He had felt the shift in Saruman's mind like the cooling of embers, and he had marked its cost, not in the ruin of the tower, which would come, but in the silence of a voice that once challenged shadows, now echoing them. The Palantíri remained, silent, cold, still, waiting. And somewhere, far to the south, another stone turned inward, another mind descending. But before that story could unfold, Gandalf's gaze turned to Gondor, to the city on the white cliff, and to another man who stared into glass. A different fall, a different cost. The walls of Minas Tirith bore the scent of age and vigilance, of white stone warmed by sun, of parchment and ash, of quiet desperation kept just beneath the surface. The city rose tier upon tier like a carved mountain, its highest citadel crowned by the steward's hall, where Denethor watched, not with eyes alone, but with something deeper, warier. For behind closed doors veiled beneath black cloth and iron will, the Palantíri of Minas Anor waited, and Denethor had long ceased to resist its call. Unlike Saruman, Denethor did not fall by pride. His flaw was burden. He bore the legacy of a line that held stewardship in place of kingship, always the guardian but never the heir. He had ruled through long seasons of threat and attrition, watching the strength of Gondor ebb as Mordor's shadow grew. He knew what others refused to say, that the enemy's power rose while the West's resolve splintered, and in that knowing he sought certainty. The stone offered it. He approached it not as a master, but as a servant of his people, believing that vigilance required vision, and vision required sight beyond walls. And for a time it served him. He saw movements, armies, smoke, ships. He prepared accordingly. Minas Tirith stood longer, stronger, because of what the stone revealed, and thus it earned his trust. But the Palantíri, as always, gave only what was seen, not why, not how, not with whose intent. Denethor did not notice when his gaze began to linger longer, or when he began to speak less of counsel and more of fate. He thought himself immune to delusion. He was not. The danger was not in what the stone showed him. It was in what it withheld. Sauron, wielding another stone, far to the east, did not need to speak to Denethor. He needed only to direct the images. A glimpse of Osgiliath burning, a fleeting shadow over Pelagia, ships bearing the black sails of Umbar. Real things, each fragment true, but fragments only. Denethor saw ruin, and in ruin he saw the end. Gandalf had watched this shift from the moment he entered the city. Denethor's words were measured, but heavy. His eyes flickered, not with madness but with exhaustion. A man who had stared too long at something that stared back. He spoke of doom not as possibility, but as conclusion, and more than once Gandalf caught the cadence of vision in his phrasing, phrases shaped by images, not ideas. There is a peculiar loneliness in knowing what others do not. Denethor bore it heavily. When others counseled hope, he saw only delay. When they spoke of Aragorn, he heard threat. And when Frodo's name was mentioned, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. The stone had not lied. It had simply left him to construct a world in which only despair remained logical. There came a night when Denethor stood alone in the Tower of Ecthelion, the cloth lifted from the Palantíri, his hand resting on its cold surface. The city was quiet beneath him. Fires still burned along the outer walls. The enemy pressed close, but Denethor looked not outward, but inward through the stone. And there he saw the ships of Umbar, black-sailed and swift, gliding up the river. He did not see what lay within them. He did not see the banner Aragorn bore, nor the oaths fulfilled beneath the mountain. He saw only what Sauron allowed, and in that moment, the final thread snapped. Denethor withdrew his hand. He gave no cry. He did not shatter. He simply settled into certainty. Gondor would fall. Rohan would not come. The line of kings had failed. There remained only control over the manner of the end. Gandalf, when he arrived at the steward's chambers the next day, found a man not broken but resolved. There was a steel in Denethor's posture, the kind born of a decision long considered. He spoke little. He gave no orders. He simply moved as one who had seen too much and felt too little. The Palantíri was hidden once more, but the damage endured. And yet, Gandalf did not rage. He did not argue. He knew the stone had done what it always did. It revealed, and in revealing, destroyed context. Denethor had not been corrupted. He had been overwhelmed. The tragedy of Minas Tirith was not that its steward failed in madness. It was that he saw clearly, but only part of the truth. Enough to despair, not enough to hope. Outside, horns would soon sound. The Rohirrim would ride. The black ships would turn. But Denethor would not see it. He had already surrendered to the vision the stone had shown him. The cost was not only his death, but the dimming of Gondor's last great mind, undone not by sword but by certainty. Gandalf turned from the chamber with a weight in his chest that no victory would lift. The pattern had repeated, the stone had whispered, and again a soul had listened. But now he would not only observe, he would act, not through confrontation, but through the shaping of resistance. For if the stones showed only what was, then perhaps it was time to influence what could still be. The air above the White City still carried the heat of war, but Gandalf's mind remained fixed on colder dangers, the kind that did not announce themselves with horns or flame. He moved through the corridors of Minas Tirith like a thread pulled taut, binding fragments of resistance into pattern. Denethor's descent had revealed the depth of the stone's reach, and now Gandalf moved with renewed clarity. If the Palantíri could bend the minds of the mighty, then the only true defense was not strength but insulation. He had begun long before the siege, though few noticed. It was not his style to declare intention. Where Saruman had built towers and bred armies, Gandalf whispered. He left fragments in the right minds, scattered phrases, measured glances. He gave just enough. To Theoden he spoke of returning light. To Aragorn, of roads only he could walk. To Frodo, nothing of strategy, only trust. This was not evasion. It was protection. The Palantíri fed on fixed knowledge. They exploited prediction, turning foresight into manipulation. By refusing to commit entirely to any one plan, Gandalf made himself unreadable. Even if Sauron caught glimpses through the stone or through spies, they would fracture into ambiguity. A white rider moving swiftly, was it retreat or pursuit? A hobbit vanished, was he captured or hidden? The enemy, so used to controlling vision, could not act decisively when denied clarity. But this subtle war required more than misdirection. It demanded a network of actors who did not realize they were part of a larger weave. Gandalf did not burden them with full truths. Boromir had been told only of the danger to Gondor. Legolas had known nothing of Frodo's final path. Even Aragorn, noble as he was, walked half-blind toward his throne. It was not betrayal. It was containment. The fewer who knew, the fewer who could be broken. He thought often of Frodo during those days. The hobbit moved unseen through the dead marshes and into the heart of Mordor, beyond even the Palantir's grasp. There, Gandalf's truest strategy unfolded, not in power, but in absence. Frodo was invisible to all save one. Even Sauron, with all his vision, had not seen him for what he was. And that blindness was Gandalf's great victory. For it was not merely the stone's gaze that posed danger, it was the response to it. Every vision it delivered shaped action. If the eyes saw armies, it prepared for battle. If it saw movement, it struck preemptively. But Frodo moved through silence. No armies gathered around him, no banners marked his trail. He passed through the cracks in sight, guided by trust rather than command. Still, Gandalf knew he could not rely on silence alone. Others held stones. Sauron watched. Denethor had watched. What of the others? The Palantir of LOTR remained in the west, untouched since the fall of Arnor. The stone of Arnor now sat, lifeless in the hands of one who would never again see. But the one in Orthann remained. And Saruman, though broken in will, had not surrendered his ambitions fully. So Gandalf prepared contingency within contingency. He gave Aragorn the signs of kingship Anduril reforged, the banner of Elendil, but left the moment of revelation to Aragorn himself. He knew the Palantir might be used again, perhaps not by Saruman, perhaps not even by the enemy, but by Aragorn. And when that moment came, it must not be premature. Every movement Gandalf made, every decision withheld or deferred, was part of this broader tapestry, a campaign of controlled opacity, not because he feared knowledge, but because he understood its cost. Vision, in the hands of those who assumed its infallibility, became blindness. Gandalf's wisdom was not in how much he saw, but in what he chose not to look at. Even in conversation, he wielded silence as carefully as a blade. With Pippin, he withheld judgment, knowing curiosity would lead the hobbit toward the Palantir. A risk, yes, but also a revelation. When the stone was touched, and the fire passed through the boy's mind, Gandalf recognized the shape of Sauron's assumptions. The enemy believed he had seen Isildur's heir. He prepared for one battle and missed the other. This was Gandalf's gift, to reshape the battlefield without drawing a sword, through quiet omission, through delayed decisions, through layers of misdirection too subtle to notice, and too human to track. And yet he bore it alone. That was the price. Every withheld truth carved its own wound. He had watched allies suffer confusion, doubt, even resentment. But he did not flinch. Not because he did not care, but because he cared enough to be misunderstood. The Palantíri taught him that knowledge must be earned, not consumed. That will without wisdom becomes tyranny. That sight without restraint becomes ruin. And so, he moved through the ruins of war, not as a seer, but as a shepherd of shadowed light, guarding what little remained unseen. Soon, another would lift a stone. not in fear, but in challenge, and Gandalf would not stop it. For the time had come to turn vision back against itself. The chamber was quiet when Aragorn entered it, though the weight in the air suggested something more than silence. The Palantíri of Orthanc had been taken, wrested from the fallen hand of Saruman, and now it sat within the keep at Helm's Deep, veiled, cold, inert. No light glimmered on its surface, yet it seemed to breathe in the dark, as if waiting to be awakened. Gandalf stood nearby, his face unreadable, his posture still. He did not speak. This was not his decision. The stone did not belong to him, nor had it ever. It was a relic of Númenor, bound by inheritance and will. Aragorn, son of Arathorn, Isildur's heir, was the one who could claim it without pretense, without thievery. But the right to touch it was not the same as readiness to wield it. Aragorn removed the cloth with slow hands. The Palantíri, revealed once more, reflected no flame, but something in its blackness stirred, a coiling, dormant tension, as though it recognized its new bearer. Gandalf stepped back, not out of fear, but out of respect. This moment would not be guided. It must unfold of Aragorn's own strength. He placed his hands on the stone, firm, unhesitating, and in that instant, vision surged. He saw the world bend inward. Towers, plains, rivers, all drawn together as if stitched by invisible thread. Then Barad-dûr, tall and cruel, loomed before him. The eye, lidless and full of fire, turned toward him with searing recognition. No longer guessing, no longer questioning, here stood Isildur's heir, revealed. But Aragorn did not flinch. He did not kneel. He did not speak. His gaze held steady, and within that stillness he allowed the enemy to see him, not a shadow, not a whisper, but a figure crowned by lineage, wielding sword and silence both. For long seconds they remained locked in that invisible tension. Then Aragorn drew back. The connection broke. The chamber dimmed once more, but something had shifted. Sauron would move now, not out of knowledge, but out of fear. What he had seen was not the truth, but a threat shaped to appear greater than it yet was. And Gandalf, watching, allowed himself a slow breath. The move had been made, the board had changed. The Palantíri, though still, had served again, yet the question remained. Why had Sauron allowed himself to be seen? What drove a will as calculating as his to reveal such strength, to broadcast images of ruin, fire, and conquest? The answer was hidden in the nature of the stone itself. For though the Palantíri were crafted by the hands of elves and blessed with clarity, their power did not rest solely in the user's control. Once one stone fell to darkness, the others, by proximity, by link, became instruments vulnerable to it. Not corrupted, but tilted, every image shared between them carried the weight of the strongest mind engaged. And in Sauron, that strength was absolute. He did not need to lie. He needed only to be seen, and in that seeing to dominate. This was how he had influenced Denethor, not with falsehoods, but with visions strategically framed. He had revealed doom as certainty, resistance as futility, and by doing so ensured that the mind watching him would conclude despair. He did not whisper commands. He allowed fear to do the work. And now, with Aragorn's gaze returned, he had seen something unexpected. Hope, not as a flicker, but as defiance. The air revealed, a sword reforged, a banner unseen for generations. That vision, too, would shape his strategy. He would strike sooner, harder, with haste born of anxiety. Gandalf understood the rhythm. He had watched it before. The Palantíri did not simply carry information, they shaped behavior. To see was to respond. To respond was to shift the world, and thus vision became weapon, not just for the one who used the stone, but for the one who knew how others would use it. This was the genius of Sauron's approach. He did not need to see everything. He needed to be seen just enough. A ruined city, a shadowed gate, a ring on a finger. The enemy chose his displays carefully, each one a performance calculated to elicit fear, urgency, division. In every viewing there was manipulation, not of what was shown but of how it was interpreted. But now Gandalf saw the first fracture in that control. Aragorn had looked and had not bent. More than that, he had turned the gaze back on the enemy. Not to spy, not to learn, but to declare. A reversal of current, a disruption in rhythm. Sauron had seen strength and misread its nature. The stone returned to its slumber, covered once more, but the world it had touched would not sleep again. Armies stirred, allies began to choose. The eye had blinked, if only for a moment. And Gandalf, standing beside the man who had revealed himself, knew that the next movement in this war would no longer belong to shadows and whispers. It would belong to choices made in daylight. But even as events aligned, the deeper cost remained to be understood. What did it mean to see clearly? And at what point did vision, even when true, become too great a weight to bear? Even the clearest vision leaves a weight behind. Aragorn had looked into the Palantíri and stood his ground. But such defiance did not leave a man untouched. In the hours that followed, as the firelight in the stone faded and the cloth returned to shroud its surface, a quietness settled into him, not of defeat, but of inward reckoning. He had drawn the eye upon himself, and though it had not broken him, it had burned something away. Gandalf observed this without intrusion. He knew the signs. The silence that follows revelation is never simple. There is always a recalibration, a shifting of burdens. Vision clarifies, yes, but it also narrows, and what one cannot unsee becomes part of the soul's architecture. For Aragorn, the cost was not fear, it was certainty. He had revealed himself not only to Sauron, but to the world. There would be no retreat, no ambiguity, no slow return. The line of Isildur had declared its claim. The tides of war would now bend around him for good or ill, and in that awareness he carried a weight that no stone could predict. The burden of inevitability. Gandalf had long feared this kind of clarity. Not because it was wrong, but because it was irreversible. The Palantíri did not only show, they fixed the gaze. Once seen, the future hardened. Plans shifted to accommodate visions, and every choice thereafter bent to echo what had been revealed. Even the wisest could become entangled in the momentum of their own foresight. That was the cost Denethor had paid. He had not only seen doom, he had begun to live according to it. It had become the scaffolding of his judgment. Every decision became a confirmation of the vision he had received, until despair became a form of self-fulfilling prophecy. The stone had not lied, but it had rendered him incapable of questioning the frame through which he saw. Saruman had fallen in similar fashion, not through collapse, but through adoption. He had not rejected what the Palantíri revealed, he had agreed with it. He had looked upon Sauron's rising power, and concluded that the world must conform. There had been no resistance, only redirection. But Aragorn, Gandalf noted, had done something different. He had looked not to know, but to be known. His use of the stone had not been to decipher the world, but to declare something to it. He had reversed the current, if only briefly. A rare act, a dangerous one, but perhaps a necessary one. Still, Gandalf's thoughts remained unsettled. Even now, as events accelerated, banners unfurled, horns sounded, allies gathered. He felt the pulse of the Palantíri vibrating through the weave of action. The stones, silent though they now lay, had already shaped the present. Their echo moved through minds and councils, strategies and fears. And what of Sauron? The enemy, too, had seen. He had marked Aragorn's claim. He had watched the shaping of resistance, and he would move accordingly. The eye once fixed on the Shire, now turned westward, toward Minas Tirith, toward Andúril, toward the returning line of kings. This redirection was not a victory, it was a gamble, for while Frodo moved still unseen, the eye's attention had been drawn away from him only by the magnitude of Aragorn's signal. The ring's path had been cloaked in silence, protected by misdirection, but the Palantír had lit a beacon, and the enemy would not be idle. Gandalf's concern deepened not in doubt of Aragorn's strength, but in understanding the nature of sight. What Sauron had seen, he would respond to, but responses, once set in motion, had consequences, and even the truest vision could lead to false confidence. Thus, the deeper danger emerged, not just in what the stone revealed, but in what it demanded afterward. The clarity of a moment became the justification for the momentum that followed. Strategy ossified into fate. Options collapsed into obligation, and soon men no longer made choices. They fulfilled roles shaped by vision. Gandalf had seen this unfold in ages past, when foresight became tyranny, when prophecy became prison. He had studied the downfall of kings who ruled by certainty, and the ruin of realms where vision outpaced wisdom. The Palantíri, for all their grace and power, carried this shadow with them always. Now, the war surged forward. Armies moved, messages flew. Aragorn took the paths of the dead. Gondor lit its fires. Sauron released his legions. The vision had passed, but its imprint remained. And still, Gandalf feared the quiet price, that in seeing too much they had narrowed the space for chance, that in forcing the enemy to act, they had also locked themselves into a spiral of action, that freedom once shaped by vision becomes constrained by it. But hope remained, not in knowledge, but in unknowing. Frodo walked where no gaze followed. Sam moved with no prophecy to guide him. In their blindness there was possibility, and that perhaps was the only antidote to the eye. To resist the Palantíri was not to reject vision. It was to leave space for what could not yet be seen. The battlefield unfolded like a wound beneath a darkening sky. Smoke curled from ruined towers, ash drifted with the wind, and the clang of steel had long given way to the silence that follows exhaustion. The great armies had clashed and broken. Minas Tirith still stood, though scarred. Yet even here, amid the weight of ruin and the sharp breath of survival, the deeper conflict pressed on, one not of sword or shield, but of vision. The convergence had begun. All that the Palantíri had shaped, directly or by echo, was now colliding in motion. Denethor's despair had opened a void in Gondor's leadership, one Gandalf had filled not with claim but with necessity. Aragorn's revelation had drawn the eye eastward, and that gaze had stirred the enemy to premature war. Rohan had arrived when all seemed lost, not by design but by defiance, and from the shadows of secrecy, Frodo and Sam pressed on unnoticed. Gandalf stood upon the walls as the air settled, his cloak heavy with dust and time. He felt the weight of it all, the long threads that had wound toward this moment, and the invisible currents still pushing forward. The Palantíri had not simply shown things. They had set the tempo, and now the music reached its crescendo. What was remarkable, he thought, was not the chaos, but its pattern. Every act of resistance had arisen not from clarity, but from choice. Denethor had seen too much and fallen. Saruman had believed too fully, and but those who endured, Theoden, Elwyn, Faramir, Frodo, They had acted without full knowledge. They had stepped into darkness without demanding a map. That was what the enemy, for all his sight, had never understood. That vision did not equate to wisdom, and foresight could not account for grace. The Palantíri had been tools once, in a world where wisdom reigned. But now they functioned as accelerants. They made rulers act too quickly, made fears arrive too soon. The images they showed were real, yes, but only in part and never in whole. Sauron had wielded his stone not like a window, but like a lure. What he allowed others to see became bait. What they feared he magnified. And yet even that power had limits. When Aragorn revealed himself, he had inverted the mechanism. He had given Sauron a vision, not of weakness, but of challenge. The enemy, ever certain of his ability to shape minds through images, now found himself reacting. Gandalf saw it in the movements of Mordor's armies, no longer precise, but panicked, no longer orchestrated, but rushed. Fear had entered the eye. Still, Gandalf did not rejoice. The stones, even silent, remained. Their influence echoed beyond their visions. For every strategy now deployed bore the imprint of something previously glimpsed. Every ally moved in response to the image of doom once seen. Even hope had become reactive, a force born not of light but of resisting shadow. This was the long cost, the echo that remained after the stones were laid down. They had taught minds to respond, not to reflect, to prepare, not to ponder. And now, as Middle-earth bent toward final contest, the danger was not merely defeat, but exhaustion. A world that had been forced to see too much too quickly, now frayed at the edges. Gandalf closed his eyes. He thought of Elendil, who had once held the stones in a brighter age, when vision had not yet decayed into suspicion. He thought of the Sea Kings who had used them not to command, but to stay connected, not to rule, but to serve. That age was long gone, drowned beneath waves of pride and ruin, and yet the memory lingered, soft as mist, faint as song. Perhaps, he thought, that was what must be recovered. Not the stones themselves, but the capacity to look without them, to lead without always seeing, to act without the crutch of perfect information. He had seen too well what foresight could destroy when it lost its humility. Below, in the ruins of the Pelennor, soldiers buried the dead. No song marked their labor, only silence and shovels, and the slow return of breath to a land too long held by shadow. It was here, in this quiet aftermath, that Gandalf found the clearest truth, that vision, no matter how pure, must be tempered by mercy. He looked to the east, where the final move approached. Frodo walked in lands no Palantir could reach, carrying the burden none could share. And that, Gandalf thought, was the final hope, not in strategy, but in the unknown. In the path, unwatched, in the courage that did not need to see. There was still time for ruin, but there was also time for something. The eye had looked and it had seen, but it had not understood. The shadow of Barad-dûr had fallen, but the echo of its gaze lingered. Though the tower was broken and the eye extinguished, the air across Middle-earth did not immediately lighten. Victory, hard won and hallowed, settled not as triumph but as stillness, the kind that comes after thunder, when silence bears the weight of what has passed. In the days that followed, Gandalf walked, not as a warrior nor as a herald, but as a witness. The world had shifted. Armies disbanded, crowns were claimed, songs were sung in tongues both old and newly emboldened. And yet beneath the surface where memory lies long, the traces of the Palantíri remained. The stones themselves had not shattered with the fall of Sauron. They endured, as they always had. The one of Minas Tirith still rested beneath white cloth. The orphaned stone remained untouched now, but marked by all it had seen. Others were lost to sea or ruin, but their history lingered in the thoughts of those who had looked. The stones did not forget, and neither did those who had touched them. Gandalf sat in the court of the new king. Beneath banners that fluttered in clean wind, Aragorn bore the crown with grace, but not ease. The memory of the Palantíri remained with him, carved not into his flesh but into his choices. He had used the stone not to seek control, but to provoke movement. He had drawn Sauron's eye to himself, knowing the cost. And now, even in peace, the mark of that moment lingered in his gaze. He saw farther, not with the stone but with the echo of what it had shown him. Yet he no longer sought such sight. That Gandalf believed was the true triumph, not in resisting corruption, but in laying aside the desire to look again. The cost of vision was not merely exhaustion or despair. It was attachment to certainty, to strategy, to the illusion of control. The Palantíri offered the comfort of clarity, and in doing so, they tempted the wise to trust what was shown more than what was felt. Denethor had become captive to that clarity. Saruman had become its mimic. But Aragorn, now crowned, had stepped beyond it. Gandalf moved through the city with quiet purpose. He spoke little of the stones, and only to those who had been near their influence. To Faramir he offered reflection, not warning. To Edwin he spoke of choice, not destiny. And to Frodo, when they met again beneath the trees of Ithilien, he said nothing of the Palantíri at all, for Frodo had seen what no stone could reveal. He had walked through a darkness no vision could capture, and returned changed. His wounds were not visible, but they ran deep. He had borne the burden of the ring, through lands the enemy believed unseen, and it was that blindness, Sauron's over-reliance on vision, that had undone him. The irony was complete. While the enemy watched towers and banners, the smallest hands moved beneath his sight. The ring had been destroyed not by might or plan, but by fracture and mercy, failure and chance. None had foreseen the final act, not even Gandalf, especially not Gandalf. And that, he now understood, was the heart of it. The Palantíri were not dangerous because they lied. They were dangerous because they excluded. They reduced the world to what could be seen, and what could be seen was never the whole. Love could not be seen, nor loyalty, nor the quiet decision to spare an enemy's life, or to carry a burden one step farther than one's strength allowed. Those things lived outside the stone, and it was in those unseen spaces that the fate of Middle-earth had truly turned. So Gandalf did not return to the Palantír. He did not urge its destruction, nor press for its use. He let it rest, shrouded, inert, a relic of another age. The future would be shaped not by sight, but by stewardship, by choices made in uncertainty, by courage that required no confirmation. The time of the ring was over. The time of vision had passed, and in its place perhaps a quieter age would rise, not free of danger, for danger is never absent, but free of the illusion that danger can be mastered by looking too far ahead. As the sun set over the fields of Pelennor, washing the stones of the city in gold and shadow, Gandalf stood alone upon a high terrace. The wind stirred his robes, and in his hands he held no staff, no map, no plan, only time, only memory. The Palantíri had once offered a way to hold the world in view, but now the world moved on, seen not through glass, but through grace. In the days after victory, as the wounded healed and the white trees stood blooming once more in the court of the king, the world did not roar with celebration. It exhaled slowly, carefully, as though even triumph had to be learned again. In that quiet, the deeper truths surfaced, those hidden beneath the thunder of war revealed only when the noise had faded. Gandalf walked often in the gardens of the city, where the walls no longer bled firelight, but caught the soft reflection of spring. His thoughts no longer moved with urgency, but they remained heavy, not with fear, nor with grief, with memory. For though the ring was gone and the eye extinguished, Gandalf knew the shaping had not ended. The great events of the war, the battles, the coronations, the ruin of Mordor, these were the visible shifts, but beneath them lay the subtler legacies, the quieter convergences that would ripple through ages yet unwritten. The Palantíri had been silent in the final days. No new visions had passed, no minds had crossed their thresholds. But Gandalf understood the truth that few others grasped. The danger of the stones had never been in their use alone. It was in what they left behind. Denethor was gone. Saruman, broken and besmirched, wandered without name or honor. Yet both had left their mark, not in policy or blood, but in a way of seeing, a habit of interpreting the world through fear and strategy. The stone had not corrupted them. It had narrowed them, and that narrowing was an inheritance, passed not only through power, but through memory. Minas Tirith still bore the echo of Denethor's despair. Its people, though hopeful, still looked with cautious eyes. They had been trained to expect ruin, to see hope as temporary. That lens, Gandalf knew, would not vanish in a single season. Even Aragorn, though wise, walked with a quiet tension in his step. He had wielded sight once to great effect. He had not returned to the Palantir since. But the knowing remained. It shaped his caution, his patience, his measured tone. A king who had seen too clearly must learn again how to lead without vision. That would be his final test, not whether he could rule, but whether he could trust what he could no longer see. And Frodo had returned in body, but not in peace. The ring had cut deeper than the stones ever could, but Gandalf wondered if the two were not siblings in function, both tools of knowledge, both promising control, both extracting a toll the bearer could not foresee. Frodo had not seen the enemy. He had felt him directly, and in that encounter he had become part of a story that no stone could have predicted. It was there, in that contradiction, that the hidden victory lay. The Palantíri had been trusted to reveal the world, but the fate of that world had been changed by those who moved beyond what might be seen. Sam, who walked when strength failed. Eoward, who struck when death seemed certain. Gollum, whose betrayal completed what no plan had achieved. Gandalf stood again before the Stone of Orthann. It had been placed within a guarded chamber now, sealed behind iron and will. It gave no light, yet he felt its weight not just in the stone itself, but in what it represented, a way of being that the new age must resist. He did not fear its power, not any more, but he feared the ease with which its logic endured. The idea that seeing was mastering, that knowledge was freedom. The stone had promised both and delivered neither. And yet Gandalf did not call for its destruction. That, too, would be a kind of blindness. The stone had once been noble, once intended to preserve harmony between distant realms. Its fall had not come from within, but from the hands that sought to own it. Perhaps one day, in a gentler age, its light could serve again, not as authority, but as remembrance. For now it must sleep. The world had turned. The War of the Ring was over. But the war for interpretation, the quiet shaping of how the past would be understood, was only beginning. Gandalf walked from the chamber without looking back. The corridors were cool, echoing with footsteps that would soon be forgotten. Above him, the city stirred toward morning, and within that stirring, there was choice, to see or not to see, to trust or to watch, to shape or to serve. The Palantíri had shown what was, but Middle-earth would be defined not by what it saw, but by what it chose when no vision came. The sea lapped gently against the shores of Mithlond, where white gulls drifted through the air like slow living memories. A soft mist clung to the water, catching the morning light in veils of silver. Here, at the edge of the world, where ships waited with sails furled and time moved, not with urgency but with farewell, Gandalf stood once more, not as Mithrandir the Grey, nor as the White Rider, but as something quieter, a witness, a remnant. He had seen the end of one age and the trembling birth of another. The ring was gone. The kings had risen. The roads of Middle-earth turned now to peace, or at least the echo of it. But peace, Gandalf knew, was not an absence of danger. It was a decision, a way of seeing, and no object in all his long memory had more dangerously shaped how others saw than the Palantíri. He thought of them now not as artifacts but as moments suspended in form, crystalline thresholds through which the past had pressed its will upon the present. The stones had not caused evil, yet they had accelerated it. They had offered sight, and in doing so, had stolen patience. They had given clarity, and thus robbed the soul of ambiguity, of contemplation, of quiet grace. In Elrond's halls, the last untouched Palantir remained, the one of Elostirion, which had looked westward to the undying lands and never been darkened by the enemy's hand. Of all the seeing stones, it alone had served no mortal purpose in the wars of men. It had not warned, it had not misled, it had only gazed across the sea, constant, unblinking, a reminder not of control, but of distance. Gandalf had never used it. He had passed it often, walked beside the tower where it slept, but never once did he place his hand upon its surface. It was not mistrust that stayed him, it was reverence, for this stone did not speak of strategy or dominion. It offered no knowledge of armies or shadows, it offered only longing. And perhaps that, in the end, was what separated it from its brethren. The other stones had been used in service of war. Elostirion's stone had remained untouched because its gaze offered nothing useful, only the light of a far shore and the ache of all that lay beyond reach. In a world obsessed with action, it had no voice, but in this hour of ending, Gandalf understood its worth more than any other. He stood at the ship's edge now, feeling the wind shift gently through his hair. Frodo sat quietly nearby, eyes not on the sea but on the horizon, as if watching a world slip from behind him. Neither spoke, neither needed to. They had both passed beyond the reach of strategy, beyond prophecy, beyond the shadow of the stones. For the final lesson of the Palantíri was not how they had failed, but how they had been misunderstood. The hunger for control had warped their purpose. The need to see had overridden the courage to trust. The fall of Saruman, the despair of Denethor, even the strain in Aragorn's steady bearing, these were not crimes of weakness. They were the echo of a deeper fear, that without sight one could not act. But Gandalf had learned another path. The hands that saved the world had not seen clearly. They had felt, they had stumbled, they had chosen with incomplete knowledge and imperfect strength. Sam's faith, Frodo's persistence, even Gollum's ruinous hunger, all had shaped the end more profoundly than any vision through glass. The white ship stirred beneath his feet. The tide had turned. He looked back one last time at the lands he had walked for so long. Forests, mountains, fields, soaked in both blood and laughter. He thought of all who remained, of Pippin and Merry, who would carry stories, of Aragorn, who would rule not as one who saw all things, but as one who learned to listen again. And of the stones silent now, resting in guarded places, or lost in waters too deep to retrieve. Perhaps they would one day be lifted again, perhaps not. The world would decide. But he hoped deeply quietly, that Middle-earth had learned, that sight was never meant to replace wisdom, that vision must bow to mercy, that the unseen paths, though perilous, often led to the truest victories. As the ship moved forward, cutting the glassy water without sound, Gandalf breathed in the salt air. He felt no burden, no weight of destiny, only the vastness of the unknown ahead, and the soft comfort of leaving behind what had once demanded to be seen. The Palantíri had ruled by gaze, but now the eyes closed, and a new age opened, not in clarity, but in wonder. Some things endure beyond the telling. Though the ships had passed into the west, though the banners of war had been lowered and peace declared in the cities of stone and sun, the echo of what had been seen remained, not as a shadow, no longer, but as a faint impression, a memory behind the eyes, for sight, once stretched beyond its rightful reach, never fully contracts. In the years that followed the fall of the Dark Tower, the Palantíri became objects of silence. They were neither destroyed nor worshipped. They were locked away, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. A sealed room in Minas Tirith, an untouched vault in the depths of Orthanc. No proclamations were made, no laws passed. Yet all who had lived through the war knew, some things are not meant to be held too long in the gaze. It was said that Aragorn, now Elessar, king of the reunited realm, never again looked into the stone. He had used it once to declare, once to provoke, and never again. The weight of rule was burden enough without the temptation of certainty. He ruled not by foresight, but by counsel and by listening, and that, more than any war won, was what healed the realm. The age of the eye had passed, and with it the age of absolute knowledge. But in the quieter corners of Middle-earth, the question remained, what had the Palantíri truly been? Were they simply relics, tools of communication twisted by time? Or had they revealed something deeper, a lesson that the world, even in its peace, must not forget? Gandalf's voice had once offered guidance through the fog of war. Now it echoed only in memory, yet the choices he made, the restraint he kept, the silences he honored, left their imprint. He had taught the stewards of this new age that vision, however bright, must bow to wisdom, that insight must be paired with trust, that to act justly often meant to act without full understanding. And so the stones, though silent, remained part of the world, not through their use, but through the stories they shaped. Denethor's fall was studied in quiet halls. Saruman's descent became caution told to apprentices, and Frodo's unseen journey, the only one not mapped by glass or fire, became legend, whispered around hearths, as a reminder that not all heroes carry torches. Some simply walk in the dark and do not turn aside. Even Samwise in the years that followed felt the ripple. He had not touched the stones, yet he bore the same knowledge that seeing too far ahead could blind you to what stood before you. He tended gardens, spoke kindly, and raised children in a world no longer defined by what might come, but by what could be nurtured. The elves had departed. The old wisdom faded slowly into song. And yet, in a tower overlooking the sea, one stone remained. The Palantir of Elostirion, still gazing westward, unclaimed, untouched. It had never shown battle, nor doom, nor shifting banners, only light across water. Perhaps that, too, was a kind of wisdom. To look and see only the distance, to see something unreachable, and not seek to possess it. There would be other ages, other rulers, other temptations. The Palantíri might yet be found again, raised, studied, used. The nature of power is not to sleep forever. But Gandalf had planted something in the hearts of those who would come after. Not a command, not a doctrine, but a deeper sense that true sight is not given by glass or stone. It is found in humility, in silence, in the willingness to not know. The world turned slowly, and with each season the urgency of the old war softened into story. And yet, sometimes on clear nights, when the wind rose from the east and the stars shone with unusual sharpness, there were those who claimed to feel the gaze again, not of the enemy long gone, but of something older, not malevolent but watchful, as though the stones even in slumber remembered what it was to be bridges, and yearned again to connect what had been sundered. But for now they slept. The world did not need them. The world had learned to walk without the need to see all ends, and in that walking it became free. So the age of the Palantíri passed, not with a final vision, not with destruction, but with the closing of a lid, the drawing of a curtain, the soft closing of a door, and beyond that door, the new age waited, unlit by fire or glass, yet full of paths still hidden and stories still unfolding. The end.